afternoon. So I am Valerie Klingerman, and I'm with Purdue Extension in Knox County, Indiana, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resource Educator. And today I'll be talking about raising strawberries. And Tanya Short, who's also here today, she will be talking about making jams and jellies with those strawberries. Also, I've got my contact information up here in my email. You can also find me on Facebook, and it's that Purdue Extension Knox County A&R, and then our county website. And again, you can just look that up by looking up Purdue Extension Knox County. We are recording today, so we will get links shared, and I'll share a link at the end where you can give us your email address. That way we can get those links to you once we get them uploaded, and any handouts that we have that we would like to share, we'll send those along as well via email. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So strawberries really are one of the easiest fruits to raise in Indiana, because pretty much all the other fruits are either shrubs or trees, and they require a lot of pruning and pinching and whatnot. So they do take a lot of maintenance. Strawberries require some maintenance as well, but definitely a little bit easier and less confusing, because as soon as you start trying to prune a tree, it gets pretty overwhelming. And I know when I stand and stare at my fruit trees, I'm like, all right, and I'm out walking around in circles going, yeah, I think we need to take that one out. Again, you don't have that with strawberries, so that's great. Strawberries, you can plant them in the ground. They do pretty well. You can also, grow them in pots or containers, and we'll talk a little bit about both methods of raising strawberries today. So some common strawberry terminology before you purchase your strawberries, and I'm sure if you've had any experience with this before, you've seen this, but June bearing are strawberries. They fruit once each season. So I have a June bearing variety, which I have a picture of. That was my first strawberry of the season, and I got it in early May. But June bearings fruit once, and usually, they have pretty big berries, which is nice. And I like that they fruit once, and it's over usually about a 3 to 4 week time frame. And I like that because, again, if I'm making jellies, jams, making a pie, whatever I'm doing with it, it's nice to have the quantity. Now, if you're just wanting to pick and eat them fresh, you don't necessarily need that quantity. And so, you might be interested in something, a different type of strawberry. But usually June bearing strawberries do best in Indiana. And again, they usually start producing fruit May, June, kind of hence that name, June bearing. Mine typically are pretty early, and mine are typically done producing by June, which the ones I have now, I just renovated my bed, or I completely restarted my bed a year ago. And so this is my first year of production on these plants. And they're the same way. They're about done already. I may have 1 or 2 more pickings, and then they'll be done. And then I'll have to renovate, and we'll talk about renovation here later. Day neutral strawberries, they fruit several times each season. Typically, day neutrals do best in cool climates. So usually like Wisconsin, Michigan, it's usually too hot in southern Indiana or in Indiana for day neutrals, unless you have them in a protected environment to where you can kind of control that temperature that they're experiencing. Then you see everbearing quite a bit also. They actually fruit twice each season. I've had some everbearings before too, and usually the fruits are just smaller. Also, usually by the time I'm done fruiting, like I personally just like to have like that 4 weeks and be done with them. Everbearings, it just seems like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to stop picking strawberries, and I need to work on my other crops that are producing now, and I'm ready to be done with the strawberries. So, and again, typically everbearings they do okay here, but they're not real great. June bearing are definitely the best for Indiana. And when you buy strawberries, it will say on there if they're everbearing or June bearing. I don't think you can find day neutrals around here unless you're like ordering from a catalog and you see them there. That would be the only way. I've never seen them at a store though. There's many different cultivars of strawberry, and they tend to be very site specific. So the ones that work for me might not work for you, even though you might be my neighbor and right next to me. You also need to look, just like with any other like vegetable crop or any other plants that you buy, you want to look for disease resistance because they do have some disease issues. And we'll talk a little bit about that later and some resources that are available to manage diseases. But again, it's really important. Again, on the tag, it should say something, or if you're ordering from a catalog, it should say like what they're resistant to. And again, I'll talk about some of the common issues that we have in Indiana. Within June bearing strawberries, there are early, mid, and late producing varieties. So if you do want to spread out that harvest season, you can buy, again, you know, if you want early season, you can buy those early ones. If you want like a break and then do late season, you can buy late. These are just a few cultivars that are available and they kind of where they fall. I know I've grown a bunch of these actually. So I know I've had the honey, the sure crop, and I think I've done all-star also. So again, I've tried a variety of them. For my situation, the honey ones actually did the best out of those other ones. But again, definitely very site specific. So again, what works for me might not work for you. It's just kind of a trial by error, unfortunately. And strawberries are nice because they're cheap in compared to some of the other tree fruit, but they still can be a little expensive. Here's a list of some cultivars. Again, here's some day neutral. They have Tribute and TriStar. Better for cool environments, not necessarily here in Knox County. And then there's the Everbearers, so a few are Ozark Beauty and this Fort Laramie. So that's just a little bit about some of the cultivars that are available. And again, the June bearings are going to be the best. When you're deciding where to put strawberries, strawberries really can grow just about everywhere, but they do best on well-drained soils that are like a sandy loam or a loam. They like high organic matter, which that's what the OM stands for, is organic matter. They like a lot of fertilizer, especially phosphorus and potassium. And then they also like full sun. So again, when you're selecting those sites, those are some things to take into consideration. Also, just remember, keep them away from any black walnut trees because black walnuts have that juglone that can cause some damage. Usually tomatoes are really sensitive. Some of the other crops are kind of intermittent, but again, just want to stay away from the black walnuts. If you're not sure what type of soil you have or if it's well drained or poorly drained, basically when we have rains and stuff, the water shouldn't be pooling at the site wherever you're putting these strawberries. So again, as I mentioned before, if you're in just a really wet area, you can always make raised beds like in this picture, or you can plant them in containers. So again, great options. Strawberries are very versatile, so that's a great thing about them. Another pointer is don't plant strawberries within 2 to 3 years at a site that had peppers or potatoes because there's some disease carryover, specifically this verticillium wilt. So again, that's a consideration. Also, you want to rest between your strawberry plantings. So strawberries are a fairly short-lived plant. Basically, you have to wait a year before you get your first crop. But then strawberries honestly need to be basically tore out and start over about every 3 to 4 years-ish. It just kind of depends on your production. And, if you're seeing production go down and you're just not getting as many berries as you need to, make your jams and jellies or preserve, then it's probably time to, again, take that bed out. And then you need to move the bed because of the disease issues that we do have with strawberries. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Alrighty, so there's often 2 ways you can buy strawberries. So if you go to one of the local stores, for instance, you're probably going to be able to buy individual plants. But if you buy from like a seed catalog or something like that, they often sell what we call bare roots. And bare roots there's this little drawing over here, and that pretty accurately depicts what you get with a bare root. Basically, you get it's a root. It doesn't have any soil or anything around it. And then it has the crown, which is right here. And then it might have a couple leaves coming off of it. It just depends. Sometimes it doesn't have any leaves on it. And oftentimes when you order bare roots, they're usually rubber banded together and there's like 20 to 25 in a pack. So Usually that's what I have out in my garden is I'll establish about 20 some plants or so to get enough to make my jams and stuff like that with. Before you plant, it's really good in early spring before you plant, which you plant really early too. So, I mean, this is probably March-ish, February, March-ish. So before planting, it's good to incorporate about 2 pounds per 100 square foot of a fertilizer, such as the 624-24. This probably will be hard to find around this area because it seems like everybody really likes, all the stores around here have more balanced fertilizers like a 10-10-10 or a 12-12-12. The key though with this early spring is we need the phosphorus and the potassium. Strawberries use that in the largest quantity, and so this first number is nitrogen, the second number is phosphorus, and the third number is the potassium that's in that bag of fertilizers. So once you get those fertilized, let it set. I'd say let it set for a little bit, let the rain kind of get that fertilizer worked in. And then you can set your plants, again, as early as possible in the spring. I know I've planted some of mine in March before, early April. The rows should be about 36 to 48 inches apart, and then the plants within the row should be about 15 to 24 inches apart, and they'll fill in with the runners, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The key with planting a bare root is the depth that you're planting, because you can have a lot of stand loss if you get it too deep, which is here. So this, again, this is the crown. You don't want to bury that crown underground. But you also don't want any of these roots exposed because that's too shallow and they'll dry out and die pretty easily. I've had this happen to me before where I thought I had buried it deep enough and then like I watered it and then all the soil kind of settled down around it, and so I had to dig it out and start over. So again, the correct depth should be right here. You want that crown exposed, but you need to make sure those roots are buried. Because otherwise, again, if you get them too deep or too shallow, they probably will die and just not produce. So, or they won't do well. They might be just really slow to get established and struggling. So definitely the depth of those bare roots is really important. It's also good, like when you're digging the hole, you want to make sure to get it deep enough to where the roots, you can like kind of straighten those roots out. You can even kind of trim those to get them to fit in the hole, but you don't necessarily want to like force them in a hole and wrap them around that hole. Because again, it's just, they don't necessarily prefer that. So, just another little pointer with getting a good establishment, when you're planting these. If you buy individual plants from the store, you can just plant them at the soil level that's in the container. All right, so strawberries, it's really important to keep them weed-free at all times, especially the first year. And that's what I struggled with last year. I was doing pretty good with my weed management, and then I got sloppy and the weeds took over, and so my plants aren't nearly as big as they should be. And they're not producing near as much as they should be just because I neglected the weed management on them. Also pinch those flowers because, again, that first year you don't want them to produce a strawberry. You want them to put all their effort into that vegetation and making sure that the roots are healthy and that vegetation's healthy. Also, they'll be putting on runners, and so I went out and took a picture of my runners. So you can see the runners here. You can also call them stolen. So if I use that interchangeably, I apologize, but I probably will. But anyway, strawberries can be a little unruly. So it's good to train them. And so basically this runner was like out in the middle of the aisle where I walk. So I just scooted it over in this bare spot within the row. So again, you just need to reposition them and train them. You want about 5 plants per square foot, is generally the kind of the general rule of thumb on that. You don't want your rows any wider than about 12 to 18 inches, and that's mainly for picking. If they get much wider than that, you can't reach very well, and then you have to like crawl into the patch, and you're like sitting in the middle of the patch, and then you're squishing berries, and it just gets more difficult. And again, I can tell you from experience on that one too. I've had some very wide patches before. So 12 to 18 inches though, it's really nice because again, you can reach the center, you can reach it from that row. And so it's just easy to harvest. Also, it allows the sunlight in and just, again, and that airflow. So you don't have as many rot issues with the berries. Within that first year, then you want to side dress about 1 pound per 50 square foot of a balanced fertilizer like 12-12-12, which again, that's pretty readily available at all the garden stores. And you want to do this as the plants start developing and growing. So as soon as you start seeing growth, then you can apply a nice balanced fertilizer again. And then you can apply again as needed after that. Like if they look like they need some more fertilizer, you can apply again. And then it's really important to apply again in that August-September timeframe, because that is when the strawberries are setting their fruit buds for the following spring. So if they have adequate fertilizer there, they'll be putting on a lot more buds and they'll just be a lot healthier plants, and you'll get a better crop the following spring. Strawberries also need irrigated quite a bit. You can see my strawberries actually are kind of getting wilty because I took my mulch off, so I need to add mulch again. But they need irrigated pretty frequently because their roots are really shallow in the soil, and so they just tend to dry out really fast. So having some sort of an irrigation or watering plan, whether you have drip tape that's on a timer or an overhead sprinkler, whatever that looks like. Strawberries need about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water every week. So if we go on a dry spell, you'll need to add some supplemental water. And then again, if they're in a container, they'll need watered more often. I'll talk about raising strawberries in containers towards the end. Again, that first crop will be harvested about a year after you plant them. So you get them established. So let's say you established them this year, like a couple months ago. You get through the summer and you're weeding and watering and pinching those flowers off. And so we get into winter. So when plants are dormant, which is around December, again, we've had stuff. We've had Decembers that were pretty warm and things were growing pretty actively all through December, and it wasn't until January when things go dormant. So you want to wait till the plants are dormant though before you cover them with straw, because if they're not dormant, it can cause, again, some leaf kind of like molds and stuff to grow. So you do want to wait until they're dormant. And again, I think it's usually around 20 degree Fahrenheit-ish, 20, 30 degree Fahrenheit, they start going dormant. And so the best thing for home gardens is to apply a 2-inch layer of a straw mulch onto those beds. And you can see the picture over here that I've got. You just toss some straw on it. It's pretty easy. There's a lot of other methods too, but again, for home gardening, that's probably one of the easiest things to do. There's other things you can also use. You want to make sure it's weed free. So what I was reading, they're talking corn cobs, some chips, stuff like that. Again, the key is you want it weed free, because otherwise, again, you get a weedy mess in strawberries, and strawberries just do not like weeds. Again, so avoid grass and leaves, because grass clippings and leaves when they get wet, they tend to just pack, and they're just really wet and they pack. And so again, that can cause some mold issues and some rotting issues. With the strawberries, you want to mulch with something that's pretty loose, again, kind of like the straws. The following spring, then, just before the leaves start growing, or usually what ends up happening with me, it's right when they start growing back, you can rake back that straw. And the nice thing is that you can just rake it into the row middles and use it as a mulch. And so that's what I do. It's also nice because sometimes, you might open them up and then we get like a late spring frost, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And you can just rake it back over to cover those those sensitive flowers to protect them from the frost. So again, there's kind of a multi-purpose of raking the straw into the aisles, but most of it's just using it as a mulch to try and hold some moisture around those strawberries and keep weeds down. As I mentioned, so we're past winter now. We've got our mulch raked back, and so now we're into spring. And so spring frost. So a late spring frost can kill strawberry flowers. And so this is a nice picture that shows that if the center of the flower turns black, that means it's been killed by the frost. If it's nice and yellow, that means that's a healthy flower and it'll produce a crop. Actually, I did create a YouTube video, and just looking at time, I'm not going to necessarily play it today, but you can look up this YouTube video, and it kind of goes through that it's important to cover plants. You can either purchase row covers, or if you have old sheets, newspapers, whatever laying around, you can cover. That's really all it needs to protect them, because those flowers are really sensitive to night temperatures that are below 28 degrees. And it doesn't take much to protect them because the soil is basically absorbing heat during the day. It releases that heat at night. And so again, if there's a blanket or something over it, it'll keep them just warm enough during that spring frost to keep them alive. In the YouTube video, I actually show my patch and how I've covered mine, and I was showing the blooms in my patch. So again, if you want to see more kind of a hands-on version of that, you can visit that YouTube video. All right, so as I mentioned before, strawberries are prone to a lot of insects and diseases. So for diseases specifically, there are many leaf spot diseases, which I have some showing up at now. There's a lot of root rot issues, especially if you're on a poorly drained soil and not a well-drained soil. And there's a lot of fruit rot diseases that are really common as well. If it's a wet year, if your rows are too wide and there's a lot of shading, so the moisture just sits on that crop, it can cause more issues. So again, you want to get that airflow and make sure those rows stay narrow. For insects, picnic beetles and sap beetles are pretty common. The sap beetles come in pretty early, and actually they've been chewing on my strawberries. The picnic beetles usually come in as the weather warms up and kind of at the end of harvest. Big thing is to pick those berries, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, and that'll keep the insects kind of at bay. I've never sprayed. I think I've only sprayed my strawberries. Actually, I have sprayed them once. And it was for the leaf spots diseases, because I get leaf spots really bad. But I was, I think, year 4 on my strawberry patch. And again, like I said, strawberries are only good for about 3-4 years. So they're kind of at the end of their life cycle. And it's because, again, all these diseases tend to come in about that year 3 and 4 mark with strawberries. And then that's when you kind of have to start spraying. When you first plant the strawberries, though, like I was trying to find some leaf spots out in my patch to put in this presentation, and I found, I think, 1. And again, it's a new planting, and so you just don't have that many diseases in those new plantings. There are some all-purpose fruit sprays that you can spray that are for insects and diseases. And this Managing Pests in Home Fruit Plantings guide, which I have listed here, is a great guide. I use it all the time, so definitely a great resource to tell you, like, it tells you when you can spray, and then what to spray, and then it lists, what you're spraying for and stuff like that. When you harvest, again, you should be harvesting daily or every other day. Again, it kind of depends on how big your patch is, on, how fast you can get through. But in the garden, harvesting daily is usually not too terrible. And this really does help keep those bugs at bay, because if you're getting all those juicy berries out of there, the bugs aren't drawn in nearly as bad. Harvesting in the morning's best, because if you harvest in the afternoon, those berries get real soft and mushy, and so when you pluck them off the vine, a lot of times your finger kind of goes through them. In the morning, it's cooler, so they're a little tougher. They also tend to keep a little bit better. When you pick berries, you want to pick them with the cap and about a 1/2 inch of that stem, and you can just pinch that stem off and it'll easily pop off. It's important to allow the fruit to fully ripen on the plant, because it won't ripen once it's harvested. You also want to remove any overripe or rotten berries. So if you missed one the day before and it's gotten one of those rots that I mentioned earlier, you want to remove that and get it out of the garden, because again, every time it rains, it can splash those spores around, and so it can just keep spreading and getting worse. So it's really important to, again, get rid of those overripe and rotten berries, because it can draw in the disease and insects. So that's one of the best ways. Like I said, I rarely have to spray anything, because I always remove the overripe and rotten berries, and it tends to keep all that, those issues kind of at bay. Don't wash them before you put them in the refrigerator. Just, if you harvest in a bucket or whatever and put the bucket in the refrigerator, don't wash them until you're getting ready to either process them or you eat them, because otherwise, again, they're a really soft fruit, so that can kind of cause some, again, rotting issues and things like that. So with the June bearing strawberries that I've been talking about, they do need renovated every year. You need to start that immediately after your last picking. So I know I'm going to be starting that here in the next probably week or two. And so what you do is, after your last picking, you're going to fertilize, and you're going to want about 4 to 6 pounds for 100 foot of row of a balanced fertilizer. Again, this example is 12-12-12. This renovation process allows for those new runner plants to replace those old plants, because the old plants probably won't produce nearly as well as, again, those new plants. So after you fertilize, you're going to want to mow, and you want to mow at the highest setting on your lawnmower, because you don't want to clip that crown on accident, because if you clip the crown, it will kill it. So you can see this picture down here. It basically just looks like little twigs sticking out of the ground after you mow. And then usually I just take a leaf rake and I remove as much of the foliage as possible, because again, that helps with managing those leaf spots and those foliar diseases that are pretty common. You then want to use either a rototiller or a hoe or whatever you got available to narrow those rows, again, to that 12 to 18 inch wide mark, because that's where you want to be. And then you can thin plants about 5 to 6 plants per foot of row, because again, that does help with the disease management and getting airflow and stuff through there. Put about a 1/2 inch of soil on top of this crown, because the crown kind of keeps moving up and then the roots kind of move down. And so again, you just want to put about a 1/2 inch of soil on top of that crown. And you want to keep irrigating through September. So these plants will rebound. They'll start putting on new runners, and you'll have to continue the training those runners or removing the runners. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in this slide. So from renovation until frost, you want to continue weeding, allow those runners to root, again, train them. After that desired density is met and row width is achieved, you want to remove excessive runners. And any runners set after September 1st, they're not going to set fruit buds, so you can just remove those as well. And then again, in August, again, that's when they're setting the fruit buds for the next spring. It's important to add another about 3 pounds per 100 foot of a balanced fertilizer, like 12-12-12. And then you start the process over again, and you mulch when the plants go dormant. So that kind of takes you through a year of strawberry production. Strawberry life cycles are fairly short. They are perennials, but again, the patch will basically need tilled under, and you'll need to put new plants in about every 3 to 4 years. Again, you'll know, because as you pick every year, you're like, man, the berries are just getting tiny, or I'm not getting the crop I want or need. And you need to move it into a different bed or a different location. It helps with that disease management. And so again, here's my one picture of a leaf spot disease that has come in on my berries this year. I'm about done harvesting for this year. So that leaf spot's not going to bother me this year, but next year this could explode and be a bigger deal. So again, that's why it's important to do that renovating and mowing and getting rid of that leaf tissue. That way it can't spread to my plants that I'm going to try and get going for next year. Strawberries in containers, you can use about any type of container you want. They do make these strawberry jars or containers or whatever you want to call them. Everybody calls these a little bit different, but you can put them in any other container. If you've got a 5-gallon bucket laying around that you want to use, I mean, whatever you've got laying around will work. The important thing is to make sure there's drainage holes in the bottom. That way, again, you don't get excessive water, because strawberries like well drained, and they like water, but they like drainage as well. Use either a potting soil or a composted soil that you purchase from a store or a reputable source that actually has gone through this composting process. don't use like soil from your backyard and containers, because it tends to get really tight and just it gets real heavy and packed, and then it doesn't drain well, and it can have diseases in it and bugs and stuff like that. So use a potting soil or composted soil that is kind of sterilized and lighter and fluffier than your typical kind of soil that's in your garden or in your yard. Containers are going to need watered more frequently. So I made a comment that strawberries need 1 inch to 1.5 inches water a week when they're in the ground. When they're in a container, you know, when we get into the hot times of year, they might need watered twice a day or more. So they might need at least watered once a day, if not twice a day. And again, it depends on our rains and temperatures and stuff like that. So the best way to check them is to put your finger in about the top inch of that soil. And if it's dry in there, then you can water until it exits those drainage holes at the bottom. That way, you know, it's getting through all the roots. And then also, since you're watering more frequently, that flushes out the fertilizer. So you'll probably need to fertilize at least once a week. Because again, strawberries like potassium and phosphorus, so they do like fertilizer. So with that, again, I have some resources. So Purdue has some growing strawberry publication, that managing pests in home fruit plantings that I mentioned before, which is a great resource that I use all the time. And then Purdue also has this fruit and vegetable connection where they just list publications and a bunch of other resources that you can use. And so that's a nice resource if there's other things that you're looking for that might not be discussed in these two other publications. I'm just going to show this here, and Tanya will probably show it again later, and I'll put it in the chat box also. But if you want to receive the recorded links or the handouts and to fill out a brief survey, you can visit this link. And we will, once we get these uploaded onto YouTube and things like that, we'll send you these recorded links and all the handouts.
So I'll ask a question then, Valerie. So last week we talked about home composting, both outdoors or in a container with the redworms. How does that compare to the fertilizer needs of the strawberries? Would you still need a commercial fertilizer?
That's a great question. It would probably
depends what I composted.
Yeah, and you know, it's important again to make sure the composting session talked about, you know, we need to, before we do it in like the containers, we need to make sure that it's reached that heat, that like 120 degrees, and it's not identifiable anymore. You can't, it should kind of look like a soil particle. So I always warn of that like make sure that it's properly composted. And usually compost provides some nutrition, but it might, again, if it's in a container, it'll leach out fast and you'll probably still have to add some fertilizer to it. If you're adding the compost to your garden soil, it might help a little bit, but again, you might just look at those strawberries. I tend to slack on the fertilizer a little bit. But if you might want to at least add something, you know, in the fall when they're setting those fruit buds to make sure you're, you know, setting up to have a great crop the following year. That, you know, if you just want to fertilize once, again, a soil test is really would really help with that and actually pinpoint what exactly you need better. What I shared today is just kind of the general recommendations if you don't have a soil test. But if you have a soil test, you might not need to even fertilize that much, depending on what your soil test is made up of. And if you have questions about soil testing, Purdue actually does have a really nice publication they just updated for soil testing gardens and landscape areas. So I can share that if anybody's interested in learning more about and I can share it in the chat box here. I can probably find it here real quick and post it here too.
As Valerie said, my name is Tanya Shore. I also work with Valerie out of the Knox County Purdue Extension office, and I'm the Health and Human Sciences educator, and I'm also part of the Indiana Food Preservation team. And so today we are going to talk about jam and jelly basics, and then we're going to end today with the easiest strawberry jam recipe I could find on the face of this earth. So before we get started, I do have my little scripted disclaimers that this is just a description of basic principles, that it's not like necessarily a step-by-step getting into all of the science behind that, but it's kind of like some basic direction and instruction. And hopefully I can point you to some really good resources to help you continue with that venture if you need more in depth. And then also, if there are any references to commercial products, etc., that we're not necessarily endorsing those, nor are we excluding anyone else, that we're just trying to give examples to help by reference. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about jelly. So what is a jellied product? So, well, it's basically a way of preserving our fruit. It's a way of preserving our fruit and our fruit juice. And so throughout today, I'm going to use the word jelly kind of as a generic term for all jellied products. And so what are some of these different products? We have jelly, which is basically a gelatinized fruit juice, right? It doesn't contain any actual fruit particles, and it's going to have a very firm shape and a strong fruity taste. Jam is going to contain crushed or chopped fruit pieces. It will still be firm, but it's going to be less firm than jelly. And then the next level beyond that is our preserves. It's going to be less gelled yet than jam, and it's going to have small whole pieces of fruit. So if we're thinking about a smaller fruit like a blueberry, you're actually going to have the whole fruit pieces in there. Or if it's a larger fruit like a strawberry, you're going to have those small uniform pieces into that slightly gelled syrup. So one that we don't hear about so much is conserve. So it's a jam-like product, and it's going to have a combination of different fruits, and they often contain extras like nuts, raisins, or coconut. And then marmalades. I love me some orange marmalade. So this is also a soft jelly that's going to contain not only the fruit meat, but also the rinds, and it's often made with citrus fruits. So other fruit preserved products that you might find that aren't necessarily jellied, they're not jellied, is our butters. So think about apple butter and how it's thickened and mounds on that spoon, but again, it's not jellied. We've got our honeys, which get their name because they are a fruit and sugar syrup, if you will, but that's been cooked to a honey thickness. And then that leads us to the least thick of all, which is our syrups. So, and all of these have some essential ingredients when we're thinking about making jelly or jellied products, and those are our fruit, our sugar, our pectin, and our acid. So we're going to take a look at each of these and what they mean from kind of a science chemistry point of view. What do they contribute to our jelly making? So our fruit, number one, gives us our flavor. It's also a source of the pectin and the acid that we need to get that gelatinization that's indicative of a jelly. You can use commercial or home canned fruit or juice, but if you do that, you're going to need to add another source of pectin because it will have been compromised in that canning process. If we use our own fresh fruit, we want to look for about 3/4 of our fruit needs to be fully ripe or just ripe, not overripe, but just ripe. And then 1/4 should be slightly underripe. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why that is. So number one, we need our fruit, check. 2, we need our sugar. So this helps form the gel. It serves as a preserving agent and firms the fruit. And the way it does that is because it actually pulls the moisture out of the fruit to help firm it up, and it also binds up that moisture. So if you've ever studied food safety in any way, you know that moisture is one of the key components that's necessary for food degradation. And so if we're binding up that water, then the molds or the other foodborne illnesses don't have any moisture to feed on. And so that's kind of how the sugar plays in there. We want to look for using white granulated sugar. Items like brown sugar, sorghum, molasses have a really strong flavor, and they can really mask the flavor of the fruit that you're jellying. And they also can have varying sweetness, so it's really hard to predict how that's going to turn out. So using those are not often recommended. a little more about the chemistry in the sugar is that what it does is it actually increases the boiling point of our liquid. And we want about a 65% sugar concentration to know that we're going to get a good gel. And so what does that mean, or how do you know if you have the right concentration? At 65% sugar concentration, the boiling point is going to be 220 degrees. So we know that water boils at 212, right? So we've actually increased our boiling point by 8 degrees, which is going to allow us to cook at that hotter temperature to activate that pectin, but then also to cook down some of the extra liquid to help it all activate together for that gelling. Now, what happens if our concentration is not just right? Well, you can be off a little bit, but if it's way too low, you're going to end up with like tough gumdrop kind of consistency. If it's too high, you're just going to get a sticky, mucky gel. Will they still taste good? Maybe. You can try it and let me know. But just know that you're not going to get that kind of traditional look and feel that you thought you were going to get. So we've got our fruit, we've got our sugar, and then we need our pectin. So this is the substance that allows the juice to gel up. So where do we find it? It's found in the fruit, but different fruits have different levels of pectin substance contained in them, as well as a ripeness can also affect how much pectin they contain. So generally speaking, I've listed here some of the fruits that are known for having low pectin, and strawberries are in that category, versus those who have high pectin. So apples are really known for their high pectin. In fact, if you make pectin at home, that's your starting ingredient is apples. And so just a little bit, don't let your eyes glaze over at some of these big words, but you will probably see some of this in your commercial pectins, some of this terminology. So I just want to throw it out here. So the different types of pectins that are going to be found in our fruit, in our underripe fruit, so our fruit that's still green, is protopectin. It hasn't fully matured into a pectin yet, and this does not gel well. On the flip side of that, our overripe fruit, it has fully converted to a pectic acid. This also does not gel well. However, in that sweet spot in the middle, when our fruit is just ripe, we have our pectins and our pectinic acids, and those are the components that lend to that perfect gel that we're looking for in our jellied products. And so that is why we want to go for that just ripe fruit, not green and not overripe. So what do we do if we're doing strawberries? I just told you it was a low pectin fruit, right? So we're going to need to add some commercial pectin. It is usually made from apples or citrus fruit, and there's different varieties. So you can get liquid pectin, powdered pectin. There's special low methoxy pectin that's for our low sugar recipes. So either you're reducing the amount of sugar you're using, or you're using complete no sugar at all, just sweetening with an artificial sweetener. And those are specially formulated for those applications. And so it's very, very important to know that the three of these are not interchangeable. If you have a recipe that calls for a liquid pectin, you cannot interchange that with powdered pectin. And the other thing is, it's very important to follow the recipes and instructions, because it really matters what order you put the products in here. And I have an example next. So, for example, with our powdered pectin, it gets added first to the liquid. Then our acid, which is usually lemon juice, then the sugar is added last. Whereas with the liquid pectin, it gets added at the end, okay, of this whole process. And then with the light or the low methoxy pectin, that's a totally different process altogether, because you're not even adding any sugar. So as I shared, we have different types of pectic substances found in our fruit, and during ripening, these enzymes mature, and that's what causes that visible ripening of our fruit, right? The softening of it. Well, at the same time, the acid content in our fruit is also changing. So our underripe fruit tend to have a higher acid content than our fully ripened fruit. Well, that's the fourth ingredient we need in jelly making, right? fruit, sugar, pectin, and acid. So we actually need a fairly acidic environment. If you can think back to chemistry class, on a pH scale is from 1 to 14, with 1 being highly acidic and 7 being somewhere in the middle and 14 being very basic. So we are down on the low end of this scale where our acid level needs to be for that fruit to gel. And the amount of acid, again, as with the pectin, varies depending on the fruit variety and on the ripeness. And so this is why a couple of slides back where I said if you were making your jam from fresh fruit that you wanted about a quarter of it to be slightly underripe, and that is why, because it gives you that little extra bit of acid. And depending on the variety, though, for example, you still may need to add acid. So be sure and check and follow that recipe, because it's such a shame and so disheartening when you've invested all this time and energy, right, and it doesn't turn out right. So how many ways can you make a jelly? You can use liquid pectin, powdered pectin. You can use no pectin. You can just do the long boil method. You can use sugar. You can use a reduced amount of sugar, or you can use no sugar at all and just have some sweetener. There's cooked methods. There's no cooked methods. You can process it in the boiling water bath. You can do no processing whatsoever and just stick it straight into the fridge and freezer. So you can find a recipe for just about any combination of these. So, and I'll give you some resources towards the end here on where to look for those. So just a quick visual here, though, if you have a favorite fruit. So these are kind of some common ones that I've listed up here on to which fruits tend to fall in the high pectin, high acid, or which tend to fall in the low pectin, low acid. So in column 1 or group 1, assuming they are not overripe, assuming they are just ripe, this group will tend to have enough natural pectin and enough acid that you will not have to add anything. So it's just going to be your fruit and your sugar and your processing. Group 2 falls somewhere in the middle. You may have to add one or the other. Whereas group 3, you're likely going to have to add at least one, if not both, of the pectin and the acid, because they just don't have enough naturally. And you can see that strawberries falls into that group 3. And so that leads me to the easiest recipe ever for making strawberry jam. So you're going to need about a quart of strawberries. So you want to mash those up. Have the pieces, fairly small, but, nothing giant in there, but you don't have to have it completely pureed either. And you want it to measure out to about 1 3/4 cups of crushed strawberries. And you're going to combine that with your sugar and let it set for 10 minutes. And so what's happening here is that sugar is doing its osmotic activity. It's pulling that extra moisture out of those little fruit pieces and getting ready to do its work there. Then we are going to, while that's standing, you're going to mix your lemon juice and your pectin together in a separate bowl. And then after your strawberries and sugar have set for that 10 minutes, you're going to stir your lemon juice and pectin mixture together into your strawberry sugar mixture and stir that for about 3 minutes. Okay, pretty easy so far. We've got 13 minutes invested. Well, maybe 15 if you had to mash the strawberries, right? We're going to immediately pour it into our freezer containers or our canning jars or whatever we're planning on storing it in, leaving a 1/2 inch of headspace. And you're going to cover it and let it stand at room temperature until it sets. So with these no-cook recipes, it's really important that you let it set. Unless the recipe says otherwise, typically you need to let them sit at room temperature until it gels. Because if you freeze it right away, it's not going to gel up for you. Now, the other thing is, let's say something went wrong. Maybe your pectin was no good. It was too old. Something else went wrong and it didn't gel. At the 24-hour mark, for food safety reasons, you're going to put it in the fridge, you're going to put it in the freezer, and you're going to call it a day and say, well, that's too bad. I'm a little bummed, but now I have strawberry syrup instead of strawberry jam. But at that 24 hours, it needs to be put away. If it's not gelled, it's not going to at that point. So after the gel is formed, you can store it and put it away. We're looking at 3 weeks in the refrigerator, up to a year in the freezer. You can get, I don't know how well, that doesn't show up very good. So this is like a plastic canning jar or freezer storage jar. You can get the little, I like the little square ones that are fairly short and squat because they stack well in the freezer. Room temperature is not recommended because jellied products are very susceptible to mold and fermentation, which is also very disheartening, right? If you just worked so hard to make it, you know, you just spent your 17 minutes. And then once opened, be sure to use it promptly because you hate for it to go to waste. So what if it doesn't set? You can use it as it is. There's nothing wrong with it. You can remake it. So no matter what kind of recipe you used, whether it was a cooked or an uncooked, whether you used pectin or didn't use pectin, there's a way to remake it. There are specific instructions. It's not just a matter of redoing the entire recipe because, oh my goodness, for one thing, that would be a lot of sugar, right? But you are going to be adding a little bit more acid and a little bit more sugar and your pectin with there to get that remade. And actually, I'm going to skip right ahead and say, this National Center for Home Food Preservation, they have a step-by-step on how to remake. Well, they have a step-by-step on a variety of these different kind of recipes that I mentioned, but they also have the how can you remake it if this was your recipe. And again, because order is really importantly, like do I add the acid first, do I add the pectin first, etc. So these are kind of the go-to resources when it comes to home food preservation. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is housed at the University of Georgia. They actually operate the USDA Research Center for Food Preservation, and so any new research that is coming out regarding food preservation is going to be found there. They are also the authors of the So Easy to Preserve, and the 6th edition is the current edition that's out. I think it was released in 2014. You can also find the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, which I do also have here with me. So it looks kind of like that. Sorry, I'm not getting a very good picture there. But you can find this on the Purdue Education Store. So if you just Google Purdue Education Store and go to that link and search for keyword canning, that will get you to that guide. I think it's $17, I want to say. And I do have in this book from the UGA, University of Georgia, I think it's $20, and I do actually have stock of both of these in the office. Should you prefer to be able to go to the office and purchase one as opposed to ordering it online. And then lastly, a free download that we have available from the Purdue Education Store is this Let's Preserve series. And I've shown kind of a screenshot of the one that we have on jelly jams and spreads. And if you go again and just search for the keyword preserve, it'll bring all of them up for you. I believe there's maybe 10 or so publications that have been made on a variety of food preservation topics. Okay, well, if you have no further questions, we can go ahead and sign off and see if it's still raining. I know, Valerie, you said your strawberry patch was almost done. Ours is really just starting. We've probably got, we usually pick for about 2 weeks. So I was out scavenging for a snack before we started here earlier. All right, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any related questions.